And now I'd like to welcome Joanne Terry, who's going to be talking to us today about protecting democracy in today's environment.
My name is Joanne Terry, and I'm here today to talk about protecting democracy in today's environment. But before I start, I would like to caveat this with that I am not a scholar on democracy. I am not an expert in democracy. In fact, I'm a retired satellite systems engineer, which is kind of embarrassing considering all of the technical problems here because I know satellites. I don't know microphones and computers. That's still kind of a mystery to me as well. But yeah, that's right. But what I have been doing is paying really close attention to what's been going on in our world the last couple of years. And I've been doing some research, and I have become very, very concerned that our democracy really is in danger. And I feel very strongly about actively participating in protecting it and working to convince more people that we are facing a real threat that we can't ignore, and that threat is coming from inside our country. And I really believe very strongly that this is a moment where we all have to stand up and be engaged. So a couple of months ago, I was asked to speak on why democracy is worth fighting for. And I had to think about that for a while because, I feel like we all know intuitively why it's important. But when someone asks you outright, why is democracy worth fighting for, trying to verbalize it and trying to think about, a concise way of describing that can be kind of challenging. So I thought about it, and what I came up with is that democracy is worth fighting for because we, as human beings, have a natural desire to be free. We don't want to be under the rule of other people or to be oppressed. We want to be free to live who we are and not be judged by others, constrained by others, or forced to live under the beliefs of others that we may not agree with. And we need to feel like we have some control over our destiny. And in a democracy, voting gives us that feeling of having some control over our destiny. Because even those in the minority can still feel like they have a voice and can accept being in the minority if they at least feel heard, respected, and considered when the will of the majority is being implemented. And this is why I believe that compromise is so necessary in a functioning democracy. Because if the minority feels controlled or oppressed by the majority, they will rise up and we'll see civil unrest. We've seen that over the years, over and over. But in a functioning democracy, we don't have to spend all of our time fighting oppression, fighting for our rights. And we can focus on other things, right? Like inventing trains, planes, automobiles, rockets, satellites, TVs, cell phones. American democracy is the fuel for the invention and the innovation that's made the United States the largest and the greatest economy in the world. But right now, as I said, I do believe that our democracy is in peril. We are already seeing the effects of having to fight against oppression because one side is focusing so much on trying to control our behavior that we can't get things like our infrastructure upgraded or a commitment to save the Indian River Lagoon or to deal with our increasing homeless problem. We can't get those things done, which are things that people from across the political spectrum want, because we're fighting to keep our rights, including our right to vote, and to have that vote count and not overturned by partisan legislatures or the Congress or the vice president. And our constitutional republic, it only survives by the good will and actions of those who take the oath to defend it, right? There's no real way to hold people in power accountable when the checks and balances are set aside for party loyalty, personal loyalty, or anything other than upholding their oath to the Constitution. And this was clearly shown several years ago. It was quite alarming to me when Mitch McConnell was, in my opinion, breach of his constitutional duties when he refused to hold confirmation hearings for Merrick Garland. No one held him accountable. And now we have Supreme Court justices that were confirmed by misleading senators during their confirmation hearings. And even the senators who say they felt like they were misled are refusing to hold them accountable for their actions. So the only real way we have to hold our elected officials accountable is for people like us, regular everyday people, to vote the people out of office who are not upholding the Constitution, and to vote out of office those who refuse to hold accountable, those who do not have good faith actions to protect our democracy and to protect the Constitution. And this is why it is so important that we protect our vote. And we must do this, I believe, before the very institutions that are used to protect our vote and to protect our democracy are used to dismantle our democracy. When freedom of speech is used to get to a point where we no longer have freedom of speech, right? And you know, all this sounds like hyperbole, you know, doesn't it? People are saying, oh, you know, you're kind of over the top. And we've been, to be fair, really stable as a country since the Civil War. I mean, there are factions of both parties that have gone to the extremes, but those parties, they police themselves and they bring their own people back in, they rein them in. And when either political party, when Democrats police other Democrats, Republicans police other Republicans, that's when it's no longer political or politically motivated. That's how people can be sure that behavior can be moderated, because it's people on their own side doing it, and it's so important. And that is one of the key things that I think that is breaking down right now in our political system. So we've been stable since the Civil War, and that stability has created a certain complacency among our population. And up until the last several years, I think most people, myself included, never considered that our democracy would face a real threat, especially from within, you know, our own political system. And even today, people are seeing what happened on January 6th, 2001 as a threat averted, no longer an issue. And some, you know, even people that you wouldn't expect, don't see a problem with it as long as their desired outcome is achieved. And I want to give you an example. So last summer, the District 1 County Commissioner here in Brevard County made a unilateral decision for her district. And after a lot of complaints, she decided to hold a poll through the utility billing process. And she had about a 33% response rate to her poll, which is really pretty good considering that our primary election just had about 28% for the entire county, 28% turnout. But when the results weren't coming in the way she expected, she decided that everybody who didn't vote, the other 77%, didn't care about the outcome. So she decided to assign her preferred vote to everybody that didn't vote. Because if they didn't care, they didn't respond, they didn't care, she should be able to do that. That was a rigged vote, no two ways about it. And it's true that it's not an official vote, right? It wasn't through division of elections, it was illegal, but it shows a mindset and it can set a precedence that we cannot allow to flourish, right? That if people who don't vote, they don't care, and therefore whoever's in power can just do what they want. But when you tell people what they really want to know about that, which is what was that vote about? It was about whether or not to keep or remove fluoride from the water supply in, I think it was Titusville. And then people aren't so sure whether or not what she did was wrong or not, right? Because I know people from across the political spectrum who were okay with what she did because they wanted the fluoride removed from the water. You know, even a libertarian that I know who's very pro-democratic process pivots to why there shouldn't be fluoride in the water rather than agree that what she did was undemocratic. And we see that now, right? Many people who believe themselves to be pro-democratic are aligning with anti-democratic candidates and anti-democratic causes because they believe it's their preferred outcome. And right now, maybe that's true. But I don't think they're seeing beyond that, because I think that if we lose our ability to hold our elected officials accountable, that I believe that the time will come when even the people who are voting the way they are right now will be sorry, because when they lose their vote, something's going to happen and that they're not going to agree with. And then suddenly they're going to realize, well, we have nothing that we can do about it now. But for right now, here we are, right? And some of us see the real threat and care about the outcome. And some people who care about the outcome don't see the real threat. And my stepson-in-law is one of these because he cares about protecting democracy. He grew up in Saudi Arabia and he really cares about protecting democracy, but he doesn't think there's a real threat. He will tell me, oh, Joanne, you're just over the top. You know, there's enough checks and balances. Nothing bad can really happen. And I try to tell him, you know, well, I really think there's an issue here. And he's like, it's fine. And, you know, truth be told, we have no way of knowing. I have no way of knowing how real or dangerous the threat really is, right? Because many of us, myself included, we can see a path to how our democracy can end as we know it. And just seeing that path is alarming. And when I say that to people, you know, I don't mean to scare people, but I do mean to create an urgent call to action at this moment, because I would rather do everything that I can in my power to prevent anti-democratic ideologies from getting into power and then be told, oh, Joanne, see, there was nothing to worry about. There was never anything to worry about. I'm fine with that, because that's a much better situation than having those powers, those entities get into power and having to tell my son-in-law, see, I told you so. We were on the brink of losing our democracy and now we have, and now there's nothing that we can do about it. Because I can see a path to ending our democracy, but if that happens, I can't see a path to getting it back without really, really bad things having to happen. And I don't want to take that chance. The risk is just too much for me. But the good news is that this really isn't a partisan issue. I have talked to Republicans, Democrats, NPAs, libertarians, and independents that see the threat and want to prevent it, even if it means looking outside of what their traditional voting lanes would be. So, what can we do to actually protect our democracy in today's environment? So at the federal level, besides protecting our right to vote and access to the ballot, which are clear, obvious things, I think we also need to ensure that our state legislatures can't overturn the popular vote. Because, you know, while it's true that the Constitution gives state legislatures the power to decide how to run elections and, you know, what presidential electors to send to the federal level, the Constitution also gives the federal government and the Congress, gives the Congress the ability to put into laws that can keep bad things like that from happening. And we need to execute that power. And that's straightforward how to do that. But what's more difficult, but I think equally important, is figuring out how to deal with the misinformation and the disinformation and the influence it has over how people vote and whether or not they trust the election results. And to do it in a way that it's not being labeled censorship, because I hear that a lot right now. There's a lot of censorship. You know, we have fraud laws in this country to protect us from being robbed of our money, from people misleading or lying to us. But we don't have any way to protect our vote from that same behavior. And if our democracy is to survive, we must value our vote at least as much as we value our money. And I believe we can do this, and I believe it is possible with disclosure requirements. Because if we're going to make judgments in the court of public opinion, then the public needs jury instructions. And I think having the right kind of disclaimer laws and a huge public service campaign to educate people on how to consume information is probably our best and easiest way to controlling this kind of spread of misinformation and disinformation. And we also need to be able to hold people accountable for that through litigation. So if people feel like they've been lied to for their vote, or if they've heard something in the media that is not substantiated, they need to have some sort of a legal recourse to say, you just lied to me, and I want to do something about it. I want to make you prove that it's not right. I want to make you prove that what you're doing is wrong. And we're starting to see that a little bit, but I think we need it on a more widespread basis. And then at the state level, we need to protect access to voting, of course, but we also need to protect quality public education, because a strong democracy needs an educated electorate. And last year, when our government tried to get us to believe that math books were teaching critical race theory, that was really alarming to me because I took a lot of math to become an engineer. And I know math doesn't teach critical race theory. But what it does teach is how to think logically. And that's a real problem if you want people to follow you instead of thinking for themselves. And we heard a lot of outcry about how this and other laws in Florida were attacks on our diversity and attacks on various communities. But what I think really got lost in that was the fact that those laws were an attack on public education and the people's trust in public education, which in and of itself was an attack on democracy, because an uneducated population makes it easier to lead that population. And I think that's very, very dangerous. And then there are things that we can do as individuals in our everyday lives, right? Because a strong democracy also needs an engaged electorate. And first and foremost, of course, is to vote. And to take the time to research options so you know what you're voting for. You know, during voting, I often hear, you know, people who are first name on the ballot have a 5% advantage. But then what I also realized is that people in a two-person race, the person on the second line is Mo and eeny, meeny, miny, Mo. So I assume that at least takes away 5% advantage, but that is a terrible way to vote. It's a terrible way to vote. So we really need to know who we are voting for and make sure that they are indeed protecting our secular democracy. And people are becoming much more outspoken right now about being Christian nationalists, about wanting to put us under Christian law. And right now it's Christian. I'm not trying to be, you know, one or the other. You know, it might be a different religion in the future, but right now they're clearly proudly and loudly Christian nationalists. And, you know, Christians can live free to practice their religion in a free society, but non-Christians are not going to be free under Christian law. So that will be oppression by a whole lot of people. And I'm sorry if I'm turning and not being on the microphone. So, and then don't be afraid to talk to people. As we continue to open up after COVID, especially, you know, during COVID, we were all isolated from each other and we stopped talking to each other. And we went into our respective media echo chambers and we heard things about each other, you know, if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican. And then, you know, when we started coming out, we started looking at each other differently, right? Are you a Republican? Or are you a Democrat? Can I talk to you? You know, I used to think I knew you, but now after COVID, I don't think I know you anymore because you're this or you're that. And now that the worst is behind us, we are starting to have those conversations again. And like I said, it's different, it's harder. So I was in a seminar this last week with the Brevard Cultural Alliance. And there's a guy, David Jones. He's CEO of a company he started called Diversity of Thought. It's a consulting firm. And he said something that I thought was really powerful when talking with people who you don't agree with. He said, don't get angry, get curious. Because when you ask people why they believe, why they do, sometimes when you express it, it comes out differently and it changes people's minds. And I want to give you an example of this because during the primary election, I was working, you know, in the early voting areas. And I went up to Sandra Sullivan's people. She was running for County Commission District 4. And I said, my husband is voting for Sandra. We really like her because she's an environmentalist. And the guy looks at me, he's like, oh, she's not an environmentalist. She just cares about the environment. And almost as soon as it came out of his mouth, his whole face changed, just like, well, you know, being an environmentalist used to mean something different. I'm like, it's okay. We care about the environment too. That's why we like Sandra. And we had this great conversation, right? But if we hadn't had that conversation and verbalized that, you know, we could have easily have gotten into a fight. Instead, we ended up getting along great. So if we look for areas where we can't agree with each other, because I do believe there is always something that we can agree on with anybody, you know, even if it's, yeah, we need to do something about the Indian River Lagoon, right? I mean, there's always something. And if we start there, then we can start to break through those stereotypes, talk to each other again, and not fall into the stereotype traps that the media wants us to have to keep us divided. And finally, consider running for office or helping to recruit people who will run for office. Because right now we have county commission seats, we have 2 state house seats, we have a Senate seat that are uncontested races. They don't have diversity of thought in the race. And a strong democracy needs to have diverse political thought. We need to have rigorous debate, and we need to have an understanding of where both the majority and the minority thoughts processes are, so they can be respected and they can be heard, and everybody can feel that they have some say in their destiny, and that our democracy can thrive and function. And if we do all of this, I think that we really can protect our democracy, because what's at stake right now is not just our ability to vote, it's our individual rights, liberties, and freedoms. And it's also the right, liberty, and freedom to be individuals. And those are the things that make the United States of America the greatest country on the planet. And that is why I'm here. And that is why I believe so strongly in protecting our democracy, and think we all need to stand up and do everything that we can to protect it as well. So thank you very much for having me today and allowing me to speak on my favorite topic.